Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. That small act matters more than it seems. Cosmic horror has always depended on witnesses who did not plan to become witnesses. By listening, you step into a tradition that stretches back to the early 20th century, when writers began to question whether humanity deserved a central place in the universe at all. Tonight's subject comes from that moment. In 1928, H.P. Lovecraft introduced Cthulhu, a figure now treated as the supreme symbol of cosmic terror. Statues, games, and films present it as the ultimate threat. Literature tells a quieter story. When examined closely, Cthulhu appears limited, delayed, and strangely dependent on human perception. That tension is not accidental. It reflects how Lovecraft understood power, meaning, and insignificance. Consider this carefully. The most famous name in cosmic horror may not represent its deepest fear. That role belongs elsewhere in forces that resist description, hierarchy, and narrative focus. Cthulhu stands at the threshold, not the center. We must pause here. This documentary does not aim to diminish the myth. It aims to understand why this figure became visible while greater horrors remained abstract. As we move forward, we will trace origins, themes, texts, and cultural echoes, step by deliberate step. By continuing, you accept a simple risk. Once this framework is seen, it cannot be unseen. In 1928, Weird Tales published The Call of Cthulhu, a story that would outlive its author and outgrow its page count. But to understand what Lovecraft created and what he deliberately withheld, we must begin several years earlier in the decaying boarding houses and typewritten margins of Providence, Rhode Island. At the time, Lovecraft was not famous. He was a marginalized figure in the literary world, sending strange tales to pulp magazines that barely paid. What he did possess, however, was a growing, conceptual ambition. He no longer wanted to write ghost stories. He wanted to construct a mythos that reflected his understanding of the universe, impersonal, ancient, and indifferent. Cthulhu, far from being the apex of that vision, was a first step, a visible symbol, still bound to physicality, still accessible enough to terrify readers without shattering their framework entirely. The timing of The Call of Cthulhu matters. Written in 1926 and published 2 years later, it sits at the midpoint of Lovecraft's shift from Gothic horror to what we now call cosmic horror. Earlier stories like The Rats in the Walls or The Statement of Randolph Carter relied on atmosphere and madness, but still echoed the haunted house. Cthulhu represented something else, a being not bound by morality, not interested in humanity, and not evil in any classical sense. Yet Lovecraft still gave it form, a head, limbs, a sunken city, because the readership was not yet ready for an invisible terror. This sense, Cthulhu is transitional. It bridges folk horror with cosmic abstraction without fully belonging to either. That makes it powerful in literary history, but weak within its own mythic hierarchy. Lovecraft's private letters reveal a deeper layer. He described Cthulhu not as a god, but as a great priest of unknowable powers. In one letter to August Derleth, he referred to the entity's cults as morbid echoes of something truly alien. He also admitted that Cthulhu was only the tip of the cosmic iceberg. These statements are not minor footnotes. They are clarifying. Lovecraft never intended Cthulhu to represent the final horizon of horror. Instead, it was a tool, a way to ease readers into the idea that true fear comes not from monsters, but from meaninglessness. It is telling that he never returned to Cthulhu in a major story again. The creature's one appearance was enough. After that, his imagination turned elsewhere, to Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and the Iede, uncaring architecture of the cosmos itself. We must pause here. Most readers encounter Lovecraft through Cthulhu, not because it is the most terrifying entity, but because it is the most narratively stable. It can be drawn, described, and turned into merchandise. That very stability marks its limitations. Within the world Lovecraft built, the most powerful beings are defined by their resistance to language. Azathoth is blind chaos. Yog-Sothoth is total simultaneity. Nyarlathotep wears masks but never reveals a face. Cthulhu, by contrast, sleeps. It waits for stars to align. It communicates through dreams, human dreams. It can be named. These are not attributes of a supreme power. They are constraints. Yet these constraints were intentional. Lovecraft was still writing for an audience trained on Dracula and Frankenstein. If he had introduced an abstract time being or a non-local god form as the centerpiece, the effect would have been confusion, not dread. Cthulhu served as a necessary compromise. It retained enough monstrous features to evoke horror, but carried the first trace of something larger. The suggestion that even this terrifying figure was only a servant. Scholars have noted how the Call of Cthulhu spends more time describing cult documents and second-hand accounts than the entity itself. This is not narrative padding. It is the point. Cthulhu's power exists primarily in what others say about it, not what it does directly. It terrifies because it might wake, not because it will. The story structure reinforces this. It's not a direct encounter, but a layered recollection. Newspaper clippings, diary fragments, an ill-fated expedition. Even the climax, when the sailors briefly see the creature rise, ends with Cthulhu retreating, seemingly harmed by a boat. This is not the behavior of an omnipotent being. It is the behavior of something significant, but not supreme. Lovecraft was making a statement, quiet but unmistakable. The horror of the universe does not come from the strongest monster. It comes from realizing that even the strongest thing you can imagine is nothing in the larger scheme. This historical context reframes the myth. Cthulhu is not the pinnacle of Lovecraft's imagination. It is its gateway. Later stories would shed physical form entirely, focusing instead on geometries, consciousness, and dimensional instability. But the door had to open somewhere. Cthulhu was that door. In the next section, we will explore the older philosophical and cultural currents that shaped this figure's emergence, and explain why its weakness was not a flaw, but a feature embedded in cosmic horror itself. To understand why Cthulhu appears limited, we must look beyond Lovecraft himself and into the intellectual climate he inherited. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by a slow collapse of human-centered thinking. Darwin's theory of evolution had already displaced humanity from a privileged position in creation. By the 1890s, writers and scientists were openly discussing degeneration, extinction, and deep time. Civilizations were no longer assumed to progress upward. They could decay, vanish, or be replaced. Lovecraft absorbed this atmosphere deeply. He did not invent cosmic insignificance. He gave it narrative form. Cthulhu emerges from this background as a product of cultural anxiety rather than pure imagination, shaped by fears that history itself had no moral direction. One major influence was fin de siècle degeneration theory, popular between roughly 1880 and 1914. Thinkers argued that cultures, like organisms, could regress into earlier, more primitive states. This idea appears directly in the Call of Cthulhu, through cults described as degenerate, and geographically marginal. These groups do not worship Cthulhu because it is supreme. They worship it because it reflects collapse. Cthulhu represents a past that refuses to stay buried. According to this logic, its weakness is structural. It is tied to cycles, to rising and sinking, rather than to absolute control. The horror comes from recurrence, not domination. That distinction matters. Another current flows from late Victorian anthropology and archaeology. The period was obsessed with lost cities and submerged worlds. Plato's Atlantis was treated less as myth and more as a historical puzzle. Expeditions uncovered ruins that challenged biblical timelines. Lovecraft followed these developments closely. R'lyeh fits neatly into this tradition, a drowned city that predates humanity. Yet unlike classical lost civilizations, R'lyeh offers no wisdom. It offers no technology to reclaim. It simply exists, indifferent. Cthulhu, bound to this city, inherits that passivity. It does not guide history. It waits beneath it. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft's horror draws power from archaeology, but rejects its promise of recovery or understanding. We must pause here to address philosophy more directly. Lovecraft was a committed materialist. He rejected spiritual meaning, divine purpose, and moral order. Influenced by thinkers like Lucretius and later scientific writers, he believed the universe operated without concern for human values. Within such a framework, a truly supreme being would be meaningless. Supremacy implies hierarchy. Hierarchy implies value. Lovecraft's cosmos allows neither. Cthulhu's relative weakness reflects this worldview. It is powerful enough to destroy humans, but not powerful enough to matter cosmically. By contrast, entities like Azathoth function as metaphors for total chaos, not characters. They cannot be weakened because they are not agents in any human sense. Literary influences also shaped this structure. Lord Dunsany's gods, whom Lovecraft admired, were distant but still personal. They dreamed, ruled, and sometimes failed. Lovecraft adopted Dunsany's sense of scale, but stripped away divinity. Cthulhu resembles a Dunsanian god only, superficially. It lacks intention. It lacks narrative arcs. Compared to mythic figures like Zeus or Odin, Cthulhu is inert. It does not intervene. It does not judge. This is not an oversight. It marks a shift from myth to anti-myth. The creature exists to undermine the very idea of meaningful gods. There is also a scientific influence often overlooked: early 20th century physics. Between 1905 and 1925, relativity and non-Euclidean geometry entered popular discourse. Space was no longer stable. Time was no longer universal. Lovecraft absorbed simplified versions of these ideas and translated them into fiction. R'lyeh's angles and Cthulhu's distorted presence reflect a universe that does not conform to human perception. But notice the implication. Cthulhu is affected by geometry. It is distorted by matter and space. Truly fundamental forces would not be. Once again, Cthulhu appears as an intermediate figure. Strange, yes, but still subject to larger laws. A comparison helps clarify this point. In traditional religious systems, demons are weaker than gods, but still morally charged. In Lovecraft's system, Cthulhu occupies a similar middle position without moral meaning. It is not evil, but it is not ultimate. It sits between human fear and cosmic indifference. This placement explains its durability in culture. Humans can relate to middle figures. Absolute abstraction resists attachment. Cthulhu survives because it is interpretable. That interpretability is also its greatest limitation. These cultural and philosophical sources converge on a single implication. Cthulhu was shaped by ideas that denied permanence, hierarchy, and purpose. Its weakness is not accidental. It reflects a worldview in which even terrifying beings are temporary expressions of deeper, impersonal forces. In the next subsection, we will turn from ideas to language itself, examining how names, sounds, and symbols reinforce Cthulhu's role as a comprehensible threshold rather than an ultimate horror. In The Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft claims that the entity's name is unpronounceable, and yet he writes it. Readers across decades have said it aloud, assigned it phonetic patterns, and even sung it in parody. This contradiction is not a mistake. It is a feature of Lovecraft's symbolic strategy. Cthulhu is supposed to be unspeakable, but only barely. The name functions as a linguistic threshold, difficult enough to suggest the alien, familiar enough to anchor fear in sound. Unlike later mythos entities, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, or Shub-Niggurath, Cthulhu's name invites articulation. That act of naming simultaneously empowers the reader and limits the horror. If you can say it, you can survive it. And that survival defines Cthulhu's place in the mythos. Frightening, but not annihilating. The spelling itself breaks no linguistic laws. Cthulhu may look strange, but it obeys Western letter forms and syllable conventions. This reflects a broader pattern in Lovecraft's early writing. He needed alien names that still looked credible in an English sentence. Scholars have pointed out that the initial CT cluster mimics ancient words, like Chthonian or Ctenophore, that suggest depth, darkness, and the sea. In classical Greek, Chthonios refers to things beneath the earth. This connection is likely deliberate. Cthulhu rises from the ocean floor, not as a divine being, but as a buried reminder. The linguistic weight of the name pulls downward, anchoring it to the prehistoric rather than the transcendent. Even the phonetics signal something. Lovecraft offered multiple pronunciations but preferred klul-hlu, using a hybrid notation of gutturals and glottal stops. He said it was merely an approximation, how a human throat might try to reproduce the sound. But consider what this means. Cthulhu is not an incomprehensible idea. It is a sound with a known failure rate. That is a form of containment. A being that truly resists language could not be approximated at all. Azathoth, for example, is rarely spoken aloud in Lovecraft's stories. Its presence is background noise, flute music, chaos, nuclear idiocy. But Cthulhu is center stage, with a name repeated by cults, scholars, and readers alike. Its identity relies on linguistic participation. That makes it mythic, not metaphysical. We must pause here to examine how Lovecraft used language as a boundary-setting device. In the mythos, the more often something is named, the less fundamental it is. Deep forces, like the ultimate gods, are rarely described. Their presence is felt through effect, not symbol. Cthulhu, by contrast, comes wrapped in symbols. Idols bear its image. Cultists chant its name. Dreams relay its message. Each of these signs reinforces Cthulhu's accessibility. A truly supreme entity would not rely on iconography. It would exist beyond representation. But Cthulhu is represented, repeatedly, obsessively. This constant mirroring makes it narratable, and what can be narrated can be resisted, at least in Lovecraft's logic. This leads us to the role of the written word. Much of the Call of Cthulhu involves documentation, manuscripts, letters, clippings, academic reports. The story unfolds as a case file. Cthulhu is made legible through bureaucracy. Its threat is mediated by text. Unlike other mythos forces that destabilize language, Cthulhu is the subject of structured inquiry. This matters. In Lovecraft's later works, entities defy grammar itself. Words break down, time loops, narratives collapse. None of that happens here. The prose remains intact. The documents are readable. Even the madness is temporary. Language survives its encounter with Cthulhu. That endurance, subtle as it may be, reveals a limit in the being's effect. We might compare this to religious language. In Abrahamic traditions, the names of God are treated with reverence, or left unspoken. The Tetragrammaton, YHWH, was never read aloud. In contrast, Lovecraft's most powerful entities destabilize language entirely. Cthulhu sits in the middle. Its name is odd, but not forbidden. It can be printed, quoted, turned into memes. That circulation drains power. As semioticians note, repetition breeds familiarity. Familiarity breeds containment. Cthulhu may swim in alien geometries, but its name now swims through pop culture, and every mention is a reduction. Still, this reduction is essential to the story's structure. Cthulhu is designed to be almost graspable. That is why it works. It is close enough to activate fear, far enough to suggest mystery, but it is not unreachable. This balance gives readers something to hold on to. A hook, a word, a shape. It is the last stable myth before Lovecraft moves into full abstraction. Later, beings dissolve language. Cthulhu bends it. That bending is both its narrative function and its symbolic limitation. The next section will continue this shift from surface to structure. If language is the first containment field, myth is the second. We will examine how Lovecraft constructs the illusion of authenticity around Cthulhu, and why mythic coherence, while necessary for readers, signals the creature's lesser status in the mythos hierarchy. Lovecraft understood that horror gains power through suggestion, but he also knew that suggestion alone was not enough. For a being like Cthulhu to feel ancient, significant, and real, it had to be embedded within a believable framework. Not a myth in the traditional sense, gods and fables, but a constructed mythology that mimicked scholarship, anthropology, and fragmentary discovery. The Call of Cthulhu is not structured as a tale of encounter. It is presented as an archive, a stack of notes, news clippings, archaeological reports, and first-person testimonies. Cthulhu does not arrive fully formed. It is pieced together. That method gives the illusion of authenticity, but it also imposes limits. What can be archived can be studied. What can be studied can be contained. Cthulhu enters the narrative not as the center of cosmic truth, but as a symptom, trace evidence of something vaster, never fully glimpsed. This pseudo-scholarly structure sets Cthulhu apart from most mythic figures. Traditional mythology proceeds through parable. A god acts, a lesson is learned, a people are shaped. In Lovecraft's version, the god does not act. The people misunderstand, and no lesson is offered. The effect is deliberate incoherence, but the form remains constrained. The reader is still offered a sequence of documents, an investigator figure, and a final revelation. The story reads like a case study. That very structure reduces Cthulhu's metaphysical weight. No other entity in the mythos is subjected to such narrative documentation. Yog-Sothoth manifests as unbearable simultaneity. Azathoth requires no plot at all. Cthulhu, by contrast, demands a file folder, texts to simulate comprehension. Consider the false solidity of the mythos itself. Lovecraft never created a consistent cosmology. There is no fixed pantheon, no central scripture. The Necronomicon appears across stories, but its contents vary. The gods are sometimes described as ruling, sometimes as sleeping, sometimes as irrelevant. This inconsistency is not a flaw. It is a reflection of Lovecraft's deeper point. Reality cannot be systematized. Yet Cthulhu's role remains unusually stable. It always sleeps in R'lyeh. It always dreams. It always waits. That stability allows for cult formation, for narrative repetition, for myth. But again, that stability is a sign of containment. In Lovecraft's logic, the truly powerful escape narrative coherence. Cthulhu, ironically, becomes knowable because it recurs. We must pause here to reflect on the cult of Cthulhu, often taken as evidence of its power. In the story, scattered groups across the globe worship this being, invoking it through chants, ritual artifacts, and trance states. But their worship is not rewarded with transformation or insight. The cultists are marginalized, their knowledge incomplete, their behavior compulsive. This is not a functioning religion. It is a narrative device. The cult exists to produce a trail of testimony, a thread of oral tradition that allows the reader to glimpse the myth secondhand. This mirrors real-world anthropology, explorers documenting native rituals without ever understanding them. But in Lovecraft's fiction, that distance is emphasized, not resolved. The cultists do not bring us closer to Cthulhu. They reinforce how far away it really is. Another layer emerges through iconography. The statuette of Cthulhu, described in great detail, appears early in the story and functions as material evidence. Its features are grotesque but distinct. Wings, tentacles, claws, a vaguely humanoid shape. This makes the being visually memorable. But again, this visibility limits its cosmic function. In later stories, Lovecraft avoids clear physical forms. The most disturbing entities become patterns, geometries, or forces. Cthulhu's ability to be sculpted, worshipped, and described makes it mythologically powerful but philosophically weaker. It belongs to the world of human thought, not outside it. Myth, in this context, becomes a double-edged tool. It allows Lovecraft to build narrative authenticity, to trick the reader into a sense of historical discovery. But it also confines the entity to the expectations of mythic structure, origin, fall, return. That cycle lends Cthulhu durability in culture, but not transcendence in the cosmos. The myth of Cthulhu must be legible to function, but legibility in Lovecraft's universe always comes at a cost. What can be turned into story cannot be the story's limit. This brings us to a final paradox. Cthulhu is the best-known figure in a mythos that claims the unknowable is supreme. It is feared, named, sketched, and cataloged. And each of those acts makes it less like the forces it supposedly serves. That dissonance is not Lovecraft's failure. It is his warning. The moment we mythologize the unknown, we domesticate it. The next section will explore what Cthulhu leaves out, the deeper philosophical concepts that shape cosmic horror, concepts that resist shape, story, and name. Cosmic horror is not built on monsters. It is built on ideas that make monsters irrelevant. Lovecraft's universe operates on three linked concepts: insignificance, entropy, and the instability of reality. These are not narrative themes in the usual sense. They are metaphysical conditions. The horror arises when human minds encounter them, briefly, incompletely, and cannot hold the shape of what they have seen. Cthulhu, famously monstrous, stands near these ideas but does not embody them. That difference matters. It marks the line between what can terrify and what can unmake. We begin with insignificance. Lovecraft's 1928 story is often quoted for this line: "The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents." This is not about fear. It is about structure. In a world where truths exist beyond perception, correlation becomes a liability. Cthulhu's threat is local, a rising city, a dreaming god, a brief catastrophe. But the deeper horror comes from realizing that even this catastrophe is minor. The stars shift. The being returns to sleep. No divine will, no cosmic lesson, just cycles, like weather. Cthulhu is not the center of the universe. It is a footnote in a universe that has no center at all. Entropy follows. In Lovecraft's world, everything decays. Memory, civilization, language, meaning. Structures do not progress. They fall apart. Consider it the mountains of madness, where the ancient elder things build cities only to lose control to their own creations. In that story, the Shoggoths are terrifying because they evolve. Cthulhu does not. It waits, unchanging. That stillness is not stability. It is stagnation. Entropy reveals itself not just in destruction, but in the inability to act. Cthulhu's sleep is not a pose. It is a sign of futility. It cannot awaken until external conditions align. It does not direct the cosmos. It is ruled by it. The third concept, dream reality instability, is subtler but central. In the Call of Cthulhu, cultists and artists experience the same dream. Geographically separated, linguistically diverse, they all channel a message from beneath the sea. This suggests a psychic network, but not one that empowers. Instead, it fractures perception. The dream is not chosen. It imposes itself. Cthulhu does not appear in waking reality until the final encounter, and even then, its presence is brief and ambiguous. This undermines any clear separation between hallucination and truth. If the most important events occur in dream logic, then reality itself becomes suspect. What we call waking life may be the error. Cthulhu haunts this edge, not as the cause of unreality, but as its symptom. We must pause here to recognize a quiet irony. Cthulhu has become a fixed icon, tentacled, winged, lurking, but its philosophical function is one of instability. It is both present and absent, known and unknowable, described and evasive. This ambiguity is essential to its role. It is the figure we reach for when faced with ideas too large to face directly. That reaching does not capture the truth. It only marks the limit of our conceptual tools. Cthulhu, then, is not the embodiment of cosmic horror. It is the placeholder for what cosmic horror refuses to show. Other entities make this refusal clearer. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, sits at the center of all things, gnawing hungrily in the dark. It has no will, no thought, no direction. It is not evil. It is indifferent. That is what supremacy looks like in Lovecraft's framework. Not control, but chaos. Yog-Sothoth is another example. Coterminous, with all time and space, a being that is past, present, and future at once. These are not characters. They are functions, forces. They cannot be worshipped or depicted. Their power lies precisely in their narrative absence. Cthulhu, by contrast, has a location, a shape, a calendar. It exists in time. It is a shadow cast by deeper ideas. This distinction is philosophical, not theological. Lovecraft rejected gods. He rejected moral structure, but he did not reject awe. He simply relocated it from divine intention to impersonal vastness. The horror in his stories is not that the universe is hostile, but that it is silent. Cthulhu speaks through dreams, but the greater forces do not speak at all. They cannot. They do not know we exist, and if they did, it would make no difference. This is where cosmic horror departs from myth. The gods of Olympus could be pleased or angered. Lovecraft's entities are unaware. That absence of agency is the source of true dread. In the next section, we will trace how these entities differ, not in power level, but in narrative function. Cthulhu can be faced, others cannot. This difference reveals the shape of cosmic horror's internal hierarchy, where visibility signals containment, and the greatest threats remain unnamed, unsensed, and untouched. Cosmic horror does not deal in villains. It deals in conditions, forces so vast and alien that assigning them intent would be a category error. Cthulhu, often mistaken for the supreme figure in Lovecraft's mythology, is in fact one of its most limited. Its role is not as master, but as emissary, one who gestures toward greater, more destabilizing powers without fully containing them. To understand this placement, we must examine the entities that surround and surpass Cthulhu. Their comparison does not diminish Cthulhu's terror. It clarifies its function. Cthulhu is repeatedly described as a great priest, not a god. This language appears deliberate. In the call of Cthulhu, the being lies dreaming in R'lyeh, awaiting a time when the stars are right. It cannot act. It does not speak. Its influence is indirect, filtered through cults, madness, and dreams. This suggests not cosmic agency, but dependence. Cthulhu is bound by laws beyond its control. In the hierarchy of Lovecraftian entities, this is a low position. The truly powerful do not sleep. They do not wait. They exist outside the constraints of time and desire. Consider Yog-Sothoth, a being that knows all and is all. It is described as being coterminous with all time and space, existing not in the universe, but as its boundary. Where Cthulhu influences minds through dreams, Yog-Sothoth collapses the structure of time itself. It is invoked in stories where causality breaks down, where characters discover their fates have already occurred. In the Dunwich horror, Yog-Sothoth fathers a child by interdimensional means, bypassing physical law. Its power is not symbolic. It is structural. Unlike Cthulhu, it cannot be confined to a location or defeated by physical impact. It has no form to shatter. Azathoth stands further beyond. Referred to as the blind idiot god, it sits at the center of all things, surrounded by the thin monotonous piping of a blasphemous flute. This image, both grotesque and abstract, captures the essence of Lovecraft's vision. Azathoth is not a character. It is not even a consciousness. It is chaos without meaning. The suggestion that the universe spins meaninglessly around an unthinking, mindless nucleus is Lovecraft's final horror. Cthulhu may rise from the sea. Azathoth is the sea, the ocean of unbeing in which all things drift. Nyarlathotep presents a contrast. Unlike the others, it possesses agency and form. It appears in 1,000 guises, often mocking, seductive, or cruel. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, Nyarlathotep is the only entity who speaks at length. But even this intelligence does not reflect human morality. Nyarlathotep serves chaos, not order, and its purpose is often to mislead. It is the most mythologically active of Lovecraft's entities, functioning like Hermes in Greek myth. But even here, power is not measured by strength. It is measured by how far removed from human understanding the entity can remain while still disrupting human lives. Compared to these forces, Cthulhu appears static. Its influence is narrow, its goals unclear, and its manifestation reliant on precise stellar alignments. In the call of Cthulhu, when it finally emerges, it is driven off, physically, by the ramming of a steamship. The moment is ambiguous, but significant. No other major Lovecraftian being is shown as vulnerable to human action. Cthulhu does not retaliate. It does not adapt. It simply returns to slumber. This is not a flaw in Lovecraft's logic. It is the narrative signal that Cthulhu belongs to an earlier phase of cosmic horror, transitional, localized, interpretable. We must pause here to consider what that interpretability means. In myth, gods are visible because they want worship. In Lovecraft, visibility often signals narrative containment. Cthulhu can be drawn, sculpted, dreamed about, and described. That makes it useful for storytelling, but not representative of the deepest horrors. Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and the others resist containment precisely because their existence challenges the frameworks of perception. Cthulhu does not. It functions as a symbol, an anchor for dread, but not its final form. This section reframes Cthulhu not as the apex of the mythos, but as its emissary. It opens the door to conceptual entities that dissolve character, plot, and even causality. In the next section, we will examine how humans interact with these forces, not just through madness, but through a slow erosion of interpretive stability. Madness in Lovecraft is not a break from reason. It is the moment reason reveals its own limits. In Lovecraft's fiction, human contact with the cosmic is never symmetrical. Humans do not confront vast entities as equals. They encounter traces, echoes, and distortions. Madness emerges not as a punishment, but as a predictable outcome of exposure to incompatible scales of reality. This distinction is critical. Insanity in cosmic horror is not the collapse of reason, but its overextension. Cthulhu's role within this framework is unusually restrained. Human minds break in its presence, but they do not dissolve entirely. Survivors remain. Testimony persists. This survival marks a boundary. Where other forces erase coherence, Cthulhu destabilizes it only partially. Consider the artists and dreamers described in The Call of Cthulhu. They experience shared visions during a specific period in 1925, producing sculptures and texts without conscious understanding of their source. Some suffer breakdowns, others recover. None gain lasting insight. The dreams stop, life resumes, this pattern matters, the madness associated with Cthulhu is episodic and reversible. It behaves like signal interference rather than permanent damage. By contrast, encounters with Yog-Sothoth or the Elder Things often result in irreversible cognitive collapse or death. Cthulhu's influence interrupts human perception, but does not annihilate it. That difference defines its psychological ceiling. We must pause here to examine what madness means in Lovecraft's philosophy. Madness is not error. It is misalignment. Human cognition evolved to process a narrow band of reality. 3 dimensions, linear time, stable identity. When exposed to non-Euclidean space or non-linear causality, the mind does not adapt. It fractures. Cthulhu's madness operates within this boundary. The dreams distort perception, but they remain symbolic. Tentacles, cities, chants. Symbols can be interpreted, even if poorly. Deeper forces do not offer symbols at all. They offer contradictions that cannot be represented. Madness, there is not. Expressive, it is silent. The famous line bears repeating with precision. The most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. This is not a lament. It is a structural observation. Correlation produces meaning. Meaning produces expectation. When expectations fail, the mind strains. Cthulhu introduces fragments that strain correlation, but do not complete it. The mind glimpses something wrong, then retreats. Survivors forget details. Language dulls the edges. That mercy does not extend to encounters with higher entities, where correlation completes just long enough to destroy coherence entirely. Another feature of Cthulhu's madness is mediation. Humans do not meet the entity directly. They encounter cults, idols, dreams, texts. Each layer buffers the impact. In psychological terms, this is distance. Distance allows interpretation. Interpretation allows survival in the shadow. Out of time, by contrast, direct contact with alien minds displaces identity across epochs. Characters lose years of memory. Some never recover. That is not madness as fear. It is madness as erasure. Cthulhu never reaches that level. Its interaction with humanity remains indirect, even deferential to human limitation. A comparison clarifies this further. In classical tragedy, madness often reveals hidden truth, prophecy, divine will, fate. Cassandra sees clearly because she is cursed. Lovecraft rejects this model. Madness reveals nothing usable. Those who dream of Cthulhu do not gain prophecy. They gain noise. The dreams repeat without instruction. This is not enlightenment, but saturation. The mind fills with symbols that do not resolve. That unresolved state is uncomfortable, but it is not fatal. The true horror arrives when symbols disappear altogether, replaced by realities that cannot be framed. This reveals something profound about Cthulhu's narrative role. It represents the last stage at which human psychology can still function. It is the threshold entity, the one that bends the mind without breaking it beyond repair. That is why it generates cult behavior. Cultists attempt to organize the chaos, to give structure to their disturbance. They chant, they wait, they believe. This behavior is a coping mechanism, not devotion. When confronted with higher forces, there is no cult. There is only silence or extinction. As we move forward, this distinction becomes central. Cthulhu induces madness that can be recorded, described, and studied. Other entities induce conditions that erase the observer entirely. In the next section, we will examine what happens when knowledge itself becomes the point of failure. When learning does not enlighten, but collapses. The very idea of understanding cosmic horror begins where knowledge ends. Not in the absence of facts, but in the failure of facts to matter. Lovecraft's stories revolve around the pursuit of hidden truths. Ancient texts, buried civilizations, coded dreams. But the revelation never liberates. Instead, it reveals that the framework used to seek understanding is itself a lie. Cthulhu's story touches this edge but does not cross it. Its myth is translatable, its traces collectible. The true terror, epistemic collapse, emerges only when knowledge ceases to function as a form of control. Cthulhu threatens meaning. Higher entities dissolve it. In The Call of Cthulhu, the protagonist, Francis Wayland Thurston, successfully reconstructs a narrative. He gathers letters, testimonies, charts, and sculptures. He assembles a coherent story from fragmentary sources. Though disturbed, he survives. The knowledge acquired is incomplete, but intelligible. This containment is crucial. Cthulhu's horror is deferred through documentation. The protagonist can write, explain, organize. In doing so, he defangs the very thing he fears. Compare this to The Color Out of Space, where the entity leaves no narrative, only decay and confusion. There, language itself begins to fail. The epistemic tools collapse, not the people. We must pause here. The Necronomicon, the most infamous forbidden book in the mythos, encapsulates this danger. It is not dangerous because of what it contains. It is dangerous because the mind cannot contain it. Characters who study the book too deeply lose the ability to distinguish knowledge from delusion. In contrast, those who read about Cthulhu's cults, Professor Angel, Inspector Legrasse, the narrator, gain clarity. they connect dots. They do not go mad in the Lovecraftian sense. They fear what they know, but they still know it. Their cognition survives. This survivability signals that the knowledge surrounding Cthulhu, however dark, is still epistemically stable. Epistemic collapse occurs when the structure of knowledge fails, not just facts, but categories: time, self, space, language. Yog-Sothoth collapses time by being all time. Azathoth collapses selfhood by representing a universe with no will. Shub-Niggurath collapses biology by breeding uncontrollably, dissolving form into excess. These entities do not transmit knowledge. They short-circuit the very systems that make knowledge meaningful. Cthulhu, by contrast, operates within the system. It appears when stars align. It communicates in dreams. Its cults pass oral histories. This regularity allows human minds to respond, fearfully, irrationally, but still within known limits. The boundary between knowing and unknowing becomes visible in the language of the stories themselves. In tales centered around Cthulhu, the prose remains descriptive. Objects are measured. Events have sequence. Madness appears, but it is narratable. In stories of higher entities, prose fragments, tenses shift, time loops, sensory descriptions dissolve. This narrative breakdown reflects philosophical breakdown. Language functions as a proxy for the mind. When the text fails, so does the reader's ability to process. Cthulhu never forces that failure. It stays just inside the line. Forbidden knowledge, then, is not just hidden. It is structurally incompatible with the seeker. In The Shadow Out of Time, the protagonist learns the truth of his identity across eons and nearly disintegrates. In From Beyond, a machine reveals hidden dimensions that render perception meaningless. Cthulhu does not offer that kind of knowledge. It offers fragments, symbols. It hints at a larger reality, but remains decodable. Its mythos can be cataloged. And because it can be cataloged, it can be commodified, studied, even fictionalized. That cultural endurance rests on its philosophical limitation. This brings us to a final realization. Cthulhu represents the last point at which knowledge still behaves. After it, comprehension becomes corruption. To speak of Azathoth is to risk silence. To write of Yog-Sothoth is to blur memory. But to speak of Cthulhu is still to speak. That is why it became the emblem. Not because it is supreme, but because it is survivable. In the next section, we turn from fiction to history, tracing Cthulhu's earliest literary appearances and its relation to other texts. If epistemic collapse marks the boundary of fear, then literature marks the attempt to cross that boundary without falling. Cthulhu's first appearance, formally speaking, occurs in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928. But the figure's conceptual DNA appears earlier and more diffusely in Lovecraft's writing. Before the monster had a name, the framework into which it would be placed was already emerging. The idea of submerged ruins, ancient cults, and dream-born revelation populates earlier stories such as Dagon, 1917, and The Nameless City, 1921. In these works, Lovecraft tests the boundaries between psychological disturbance and archaeological intrusion, setting the stage for Cthulhu's eventual articulation. Dagon, in particular, features a thing which should not be rising from the sea, worshipped by primitive figures. It is not yet Cthulhu, but it foreshadows the same narrative structure: encounter, incomprehension, retreat. These proto-Cthulhu stories are crucial because they reveal how Lovecraft developed his mythos not as a premeditated system, but as an accumulation of motifs. In The Nameless City, the narrator describes a lost desert ruin whose architecture defies human proportion. This is one of the earliest uses of non-Euclidean geometry in Lovecraft's fiction, an idea that would become central to the description of R'lyeh. Similarly, in The Festival, 1923, the protagonist is drawn into a subterranean cultic ritual in a decaying town. The ritual implies a continuity between modern humans and older, non-human worshippers, a theme that recurs in the Call of Cthulhu's global cult network. The patterns emerge before the figure that consolidates them. When Cthulhu does appear in 1928, the impact is less about innovation than culmination. The story offers a synthesis of earlier elements: dream, transmission, archaeological horror, cultic persistence, and then names the force behind them. Cthulhu does not invent these devices, it consolidates them. The being functions as a stabilizing agent within a fragmentary world. Consider this passage. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy. And yet, the very next paragraph proceeds to describe it in detail. A monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head. This paradox, unspeakable yet described, is Cthulhu's defining feature. It embodies the tension between unknowability and narrative necessity. Intertextual connections deepen the complexity. In the Dunwich Horror, 1929, written shortly after the Call of Cthulhu, the entity Yog-Sothoth is invoked repeatedly, and its nature is far more abstract. It does not sleep. It does not rise. It permeates. Where Cthulhu enters through dreams and physical emergence, Yog-Sothoth enters through bloodlines, equations, and ritual collapse. This shift suggests that Lovecraft, having established a mythically grounded horror figure in Cthulhu, was now moving toward less personified, more metaphysical expressions of dread. Cthulhu makes the invisible tangible. Later entities erase tangibility entirely. Yet Cthulhu lingers in the margins. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, the Elder Things, pre-human scientists of great power, are described as having warred with the starspawn of Cthulhu. This line is brief but revealing. It places Cthulhu within a broader taxonomy of beings, not unique, not divine, but one among many alien factions. The term spawn implies multiplicity, even replicability. Cthulhu is not the architect of the mythos, but one of its artifacts. Its inclusion here functions not to elevate it, but to relativize it, to show that even a being so terrifying in its own tale is subordinate in another. We must pause to consider this narrative flexibility. Cthulhu operates differently depending on textual proximity. In its own story, it is the central threat. In other stories, it is background noise, useful for scale, but not essential to the plot. This shift demonstrates Lovecraft's evolving priorities. Where the Call of Cthulhu attempts to unify disparate horrors under one name, later stories decentralize the terror again. The mythos becomes a set of overlapping perspectives, not a fixed hierarchy. Cthulhu marks the moment Lovecraft turned from haunted houses to haunted cosmologies, but he did not stop there. These early appearances and cross-references form a lattice of implication. They allow Cthulhu to function simultaneously as myth, metaphor, and placeholder. Its power lies not in its individual presence, but in the way it ties narrative fragments together. It is the name readers remember, but not the force Lovecraft feared most. As we move into close readings of major stories, we will see how Cthulhu's narrative function shifts depending on what it is made to represent: a god, a fossil, a symbol, or a decoy. In the next section, we begin with the definitive case study, the Call of Cthulhu itself. Of all Lovecraft stories, The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, most directly defines the shape, scope, and symbolic weight of its titular entity. And yet, on close reading, the tale reveals not cosmic dominance, but cosmic limitation. The structure of the story, a patchwork of testimonies, reports, and personal notes, does not describe an all-powerful force emerging from the depths. It describes a fragile reconstruction of a brief, aborted reawakening. Cthulhu rises, stumbles, and disappears. The horror lies not in what the entity does, but in what its temporary presence implies. That even this immense figure is merely transitional, a symptom of deeper instability, not its source. The story's architecture fragments perspective from the outset. It is not told by a direct witness, but by Francis Wayland Thurston, a man piecing together the experiences of others. This distancing is not just literary technique, it is thematic strategy. Cthulhu's terror is diluted by mediation. The most merciful thing in the world, Thurston writes, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. This line is often quoted, but its context is crucial. Thurston can correlate them. He reconstructs a coherent, if disturbing, narrative. And he survives. His mind bends, but does not break. This outcome signals something about the limits of what Cthulhu represents. It induces horror, not collapse. One of the most frequently cited scenes occurs aboard the Emma, a steamship that stumbles into R'lyeh during the brief period in which the city rises from the ocean. The sailors, unprepared and panicked, encounter Cthulhu directly. The thing cannot be described, the narrative insists. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy. And yet, just lines later, it is described. A mountain walked or stumbled. The creature is rendered in physical terms. Tentacled, winged, vaguely anthropoid. Its effect is terrifying, but narratable. And most critically, it is wounded by the ship's impact. Johansen swears he saw it burst like a bubble of putrescence, the account reads. The crew flees, and Cthulhu reforms. But this sequence raises unsettling questions. If a boat can harm it, what is the true extent of its power? We must pause here to consider the implications of this moment. No other Lovecraftian entity reacts to human action in this way. Azathoth cannot be struck. Yog-Sothoth cannot be reached. Even the Shoggoths, though mutable and deadly, are beyond direct human influence once awakened. Cthulhu, by contrast, surfaces, is struck, and vanishes. Its resubmersion is not framed as strategic. It is circumstantial. The stars were briefly aligned. Now they are not. Its appearance is not part of a growing wave, but a failed crest. This cyclical limitation, rise, falter, sleep, is not evidence of omnipotence. It is evidence of dependency. Cthulhu is not the center of the mythos. It is its visible ripple. The cult of Cthulhu, another key element in the story, reinforces this interpretation. Spread across continents, composed of disparate ethnicities and languages, the cult worships Cthulhu in anticipation of a return that has not, and may never, occur. Their rituals suggest fragmented knowledge. They chant in distorted language. Finglui magluinaf Cthulhu R'lyeh Wagahnagel Ftagen. Translations vary, but always suggest waiting. The cultists do not speak of victory, nor power. They speak of timing. Their faith reflects desperation, not dominance. The creature they worship sleeps. It does not command. It dreams through them, but offers nothing in return. Narratively, Cthulhu's role functions as a mirror. It reflects the limits of human comprehension without overwhelming it. Readers are led through fragments, guided by a narrator whose fear is intellectual, not visceral. The horror is that Cthulhu exists, not that it is acting. This is essential to the story's structure. The entity never speaks. It does not think in human terms. It does not declare intent. That silence invites projection. The mind fills the void. But this is also a constraint. A being that never acts must rely on suggestion, and suggestion is, by definition, incomplete. The Call of Cthulhu thus positions its monster not as a final terror, but as a thematic gateway. It introduces non-human time, scale, and belief, but does so in a form that remains legible. That legibility is why the story endures. And it is why Cthulhu, as terrifying as it appears, cannot be the strongest figure in the mythos. It is the one we can talk about, the one we can name. In the next section, we will examine another major story to trace how Lovecraft's focus shifts away from even this threshold of comprehension and into stranger, more abstract territory. If the Call of Cthulhu introduced a threshold terror, a named being whose myth could be reconstructed, then At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, dismantled the need for such central figures entirely. Here, Lovecraft shifts focus from cultic worship and dream revelation to pre-human science, evolution, and deep time. Cthulhu is not the subject of the story. It appears only once, indirectly, as a historical footnote. They themselves were the men of another age, the great old ones who filtered down from the stars and fought a hideous war with the star spawn of Cthulhu. That sentence, buried amid a broader description of ancient murals, repositions Cthulhu from god to rival species. In this cosmology, it is not dominant. It is one force among many, neither origin nor end, but participant. The story follows a doomed Antarctic expedition that discovers an alien city built by the Elder Things, who predate humanity by millions of years. The focus is not on supernatural dread, but on rational horror, the collapse of biological and historical categories. The protagonists decipher murals and artifacts, slowly realizing that the beings they presumed extinct had created life on Earth as an experiment. This evolutionary reversal, humans as byproduct, not apex, eclipses the type of horror found in the Call of Cthulhu. The fear here is not of awakening gods, but of uncovering facts that render humanity unexceptional. We must pause to reflect on how this story reorganizes Lovecraft's mythos. It privileges scientific process, observation, documentation, translation, over revelation. The protagonists are academics, not occultists. Their descent into horror does not involve madness in the traditional sense, but rather the accumulation of coherent, rational data that leads to unacceptable conclusions. Unlike the fragmented narratives of earlier tales, Mountains offers continuity. The murals speak clearly. The record survives. And that very clarity makes the knowledge unbearable. There is no Cthulhu dream signal here, only alien intention recorded in stone. Cthulhu's one-line mention serves a critical narrative function. It relativizes its mythic status. The war between the Elder Things and the Star Spawn is presented not as divine conflict, but as territorial dispute. Cthulhu is not above the fray. It is part of the ecosystem. This is a demotion. In the Call of Cthulhu, the creature is the center of cosmic mystery. In Mountains, it is one player among others in a story where even the victors have lost control. The Shoggoths, biological slaves created by the Elder Things, have grown autonomous and monstrous. They are the true horror of the narrative, because they represent the breakdown of intention, hierarchy, and form. They evolve. Cthulhu sleeps. the implications are stark. Cthulhu's power lies in implication and distance. It terrifies because it is half seen, but Mountains teaches us that horror intensifies when explanation succeeds. The mural narrative strips away divine status. The very act of placing Cthulhu in a historical schema, aligning it with evolutionary conflict, reduces its symbolic weight. It becomes narratable, classifiable, historicized. And in Lovecraft's world, what can be explained loses its terror. That principle reshapes the mythos here. The unknowable is no longer tied to form, but to scale. The city sprawls for miles. Time stretches for eons. The horror lies in accumulation, not incarnation. This shift from mythic figure to structural terror signals Lovecraft's evolution as a writer. Cthulhu marked his attempt to bridge Gothic dread and cosmic scale. At the Mountains of Madness discards the bridge. It immerses the reader directly into a world where monstrousness is systemic, not personal. The beings are not evil. They are not even hostile until provoked. They are remnants of a prior order, now collapsing. Cthulhu, invoked only briefly, becomes a reference point for a type of fear the story has already outgrown. By placing Cthulhu into the background of a larger archaeological and evolutionary narrative, Lovecraft clarifies its limited function. It is a myth made visible, a name assigned to what we can barely face. But in stories like Mountains, visibility becomes a weakness. The real horror lies in what cannot be ritualized or named. The next section will explore how other writers, Derleth, Long, and later Mythos collaborators, misread or repurposed Cthulhu's role, elevating it to a cosmic position Lovecraft never intended. Their expansions shaped the popular image, but they also erased something essential: Cthulhu's carefully constructed limitations. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, the mythos he never formally named began to expand, rapidly, unevenly, and in many ways against its original grain. Chief among the architects of this expansion was August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and publisher. Derleth's intentions were preservational, but his interpretations were revisionist. He imposed theological structure on a fundamentally structureless cosmos, casting Cthulhu as a central antagonist in a cosmic drama of good versus evil. In Derleth's hands, Cthulhu was no longer a priest-like harbinger of cosmic indifference. He became a fallen elemental, an enemy of a vaguely defined Elder Gods faction. This reframing redefined Cthulhu as supreme, just as Lovecraft's work had begun to suggest otherwise. Derleth's editions introduced an elemental classification system: beings of air, water, fire, and earth. Cthulhu, unsurprisingly, was assigned to water. This taxonomical impulse, comforting to the human need for order, runs counter to Lovecraft's anti-anthropocentric vision. It implies a balance of powers, an opposing force, even the possibility of victory. But Lovecraft's universe admits none of this. His horror was rooted in a moral imbalance, entities so vast, ancient, and unconcerned that opposition was meaningless. Derleth's system, though narratively convenient, collapsed the ambiguity Lovecraft so carefully cultivated. By elevating Cthulhu to a kingly or demonic status, Derleth paradoxically weakened its horror. It could now be named, classified, opposed. We must pause here to consider the unintended consequences of this shift. The more defined Cthulhu became, the more it drifted toward fantasy. In works like The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, and The Trail of Cthulhu, 1944, co-authored or inspired by Derleth, Cthulhu is portrayed as an active agent, strategizing, planning, warring. These anthropomorphic traits made the figure more dramatic, but less alien. Lovecraft's original Cthulhu was passive, dormant, only dangerous because of what it signaled. Derleth's version became a villain in the classical sense. This reinvention has influenced most subsequent representations, but it also severed Cthulhu from its original philosophical grounding. Later authors followed Derleth's lead, though with varying degrees of fidelity. Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, and others introduced new old ones, new texts, new timelines. In many of these expansions, Cthulhu became a mascot, less a cosmic force than a recognizable emblem. The name appeared in titles, story hooks, and serialized arcs. Cthulhu began to act, to awaken, attack, influence. What had been horrifying precisely because of its restraint now became monstrous through repetition. The figure survived by becoming less strange. It adapted to the logic of pulp adventure and commercial horror. This cultural drift accelerated with the rise of tabletop role-playing games, particularly Call of Cthulhu, 1981, produced by Chaosium. The game treated the mythos as a system of stats, monsters, and rituals, tools for storytelling, but inevitably quantifying. Cthulhu gained hit points, behaviors, and movement speeds. While the game preserved a tone of existential dread, it codified what Lovecraft had left unknowable. This transformation cannot be dismissed as misuse. It reflects how Cthulhu functions in a post-Lovecraft landscape, not as terror, but as template. The name signals mystery, but the structure now promises encounter, defeat, or at least containment. The unknowable has become the playable. We must also consider popular media. Films, comics, and music have embraced Cthulhu as a Gothic icon. Metal bands invoke the name as a symbol of ancient chaos. Cartoons parody it. Plush toys are sold with dangling tentacles and sleepy eyes. Each adaptation domesticates it further. The image remains, but the meaning shifts. Cthulhu becomes not a warning about the fragility of perception, but a shorthand for Lovecraftian branding. This shift is not inherently reductive. It ensures cultural survival, but it does invert the figure's original function. What was once a myth of boundaries now thrives through saturation. In some, collaborative expansions have re-centered Cthulhu as the mythos apex, but only by stripping away its original ambiguity. Lovecraft imagined it as the visible ripple on a deeper current of incomprehensibility. Later authors, seeking coherence or narrative tension, made it the current itself. That change has made Cthulhu famous, even beloved. But in Lovecraft's cosmology, what can be loved, feared, or even fought is already weakened. The next section turns to the real-world echoes of this shift. Sightings, hoaxes, and urban legends that treat Cthulhu not as fiction, but as folklore. A myth too coherent, perhaps, to remain merely literary. Though Cthulhu began as fiction, it has bled into the language of the uncanny, where urban legend, internet folklore, and psychological patterning collide. Unlike Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth, whose abstraction resists projection, Cthulhu offers a shape, and shapes, even impossible ones, invite belief. Across forums, hoaxes, and fringe reports, Cthulhu has left the page. Not as a real being, but as a shared symbol, a figure used to express fears that exceed articulation. It has become a modern myth, not believed exactly, but enacted. The rituals are digital now. Images, claims, grainy footage, and questions posed with a wink that still carry weight. What if it wasn't just a story? One of the earliest modern hoaxes linked to Cthulhu surfaced in 2005 when an audio recording known as the bloop, a deep sea sound detected by Norway in 1997, was circulated online with claims that it matched Lovecraft's descriptions of R'lyeh rising. The actual sound was later attributed to icequake phenomena, but the narrative had already mutated. Articles speculated. Images circulated of vast shadows beneath Antarctic ice. The myth adapted effortlessly. It did not matter that Lovecraft never heard the bloop. What mattered was that the sound matched the emotional register he'd captured. Something old, moving, waking. Fact became irrelevant. The idea felt real. We must pause, here to consider what makes Cthulhu believable, not as a truth, but as a format. It mirrors older sea legends, the Kraken, the Leviathan, drowned cities, lost civilizations. These motifs existed long before Lovecraft, but his great innovation was to drain them of mythic resolution. There's no morale to R'lyeh's rise, no sin, no punishment, no redemption. This makes the story adaptable. UFOs, cryptids, and conspiracy culture all gravitate towards such unresolved structures. Unlike Bigfoot or Roswell, Cthulhu does not require witness or evidence. It thrives in suggestion. The more implausible it is, the more it matches its source. Cthulhu sightings now circulate largely as digital folklore, creepypasta, TikTok deep-sea anomalies, YouTube countdowns. Often these are layered with irony. A tentacled shadow appears in a satellite photo, and the comments split between disbelief, fascination, and performance. No one believes it literally, but belief is not the point. Participation is. The ritual of pretending to believe allows people to engage with uncertainty in a safe, controlled space. Cthulhu becomes the name for that which cannot be disproven, because it was never expected to be proven. This makes it less a monster than a digital ghost story. More curiously, Cthulhu has begun to appear in new religious movements, not as a figure of worship, but of satire. The First United Church of Cthulhu and similar parody groups mimic the trappings of religion while openly mocking the idea of meaning. Their prayers speak of inevitable madness. Their holidays mark the waiting of the stars. On the surface, this is parody. But at its core, it gestures toward a deeper truth, that many feel drawn to cosmic scale, but disconnected from the frameworks that once gave it form. Cthulhu becomes a god for the irreligious, a symbol of transcendence without hope. This persistence speaks to a universal human theme, the fear that our world is not just fragile, but unfinished. Cthulhu offers a myth where the deepest forces are not active, but latent, not judging, but dreaming. This framing mirrors ecological dread, the instability of modern systems, and the psychological weight of living in an era saturated with information, but devoid of coherence. When people imagine a city beneath the sea, waiting to rise, they are not expressing literal belief. They are expressing the need for an image large enough to explain why the ground feels unstable. In the next section, we will follow this image into its cultural echoes, film, music, and games that have adapted, distorted, or domesticated Cthulhu. These are not just adaptations, they are continuations of the myth's afterlife, and with each new form, we move further from Lovecraft's intentions, but perhaps closer to understanding why this figure, more limited than its peers, became the name we remember. Cthulhu has become a fixture of modern entertainment, but the more visible it becomes, the further it drifts from Lovecraft's original design. In film, games, and music, the entity is often treated not as a symbol of epistemic instability, but as a spectacle, tentacles thrashing, cities crumbling, cults chanting. These adaptations emphasize confrontation, not collapse. The medium demands visibility, but Cthulhu's power in the original text lay in its ambiguity. It emerged briefly and was gone. The terror was conceptual. In adaptation, that quiet has been replaced with noise. The question is not why Cthulhu appears so often in media. It is why it survives, even in misrepresentation. Film, the most visually demanding medium, tends to betray the essence of cosmic horror. Cthulhu appears in works like The Mist, 2007, The Void, 2016, and Underwater, 2020. Not always by name, but in silhouette, giant, tentacled, indifferent. These moments resonate emotionally, but often reduce the horror to creature feature logic. The unknowable becomes knowable enough to fight or flee. In Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy, 2004, the climax features a direct homage to the great old ones, tentacled horrors descending from the sky. But their defeat is narrative necessity. The danger ends when the monster does. Lovecraft offered no such resolution. Games codify Cthulhu further. In Call of Cthulhu, Chaosium, 1981, players take on the role of investigators, gathering clues and confronting madness. The role-playing system brilliantly retains the theme of mental deterioration, but necessarily reduces the mythos to a system of stats and resistances. In digital games like Bloodborne, 2015, The Sinking City, 2019, and Call of Cthulhu, 2018, Cthulhu or its proxies are rendered as final bosses, beings you can shoot, fight, or evade. This mechanic is at odds with the original implication, that the being is not conquerable, not even fully perceivable. But games require action. Stillness is not a playable state, and so the myth must move. We must pause to consider the peculiar persistence of tentacles. Visually, they are the primary motif carried over from Lovecraft's description. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body. Tentacles suggest reach, unknowability, and otherness. They lack symmetry and signal biological distance. In visual culture, they have become shorthand for the alien. Yet their overuse simplifies meaning. What was once disturbing in its inhumanity becomes decorative. Horror shifts from existential to aesthetic. The viewer is not disoriented. They are entertained. Music, particularly in metal and dark ambient genres, preserves more of the original mood. Bands like Metallica, The Call of Cthulhu, Electric Wizard, and Nox Arcana channel cosmic indifference into sonic form, droning tones, dissonant harmonies, lyrics about madness and voids. Here, Cthulhu functions not as monster, but as mood. The music does not explain, it overwhelms. This aligns more closely with Lovecraft's ethos. In these works, the entity is not visualized, it is invoked. The listener is meant to feel dislocated, not empowered. Where film and games often reduce Cthulhu to a goal or enemy, music uses it as an atmosphere of failure. Still, the adaptations persist, and their popularity raises a question. Why does Cthulhu thrive in contradiction? The answer may lie in its flexibility. It is concrete enough to appear in art, yet abstract enough to symbolize more than itself. It can be villain, metaphor, environment, or dream. This multivalence allows artists and audiences to project into it whatever form of instability they fear. Ecological collapse, societal decay, psychological breakdown. Cthulhu becomes an open container for dread, customizable, scalable, and narratively resilient. In the next section, we turn to how subcultures and academic circles have appropriated Cthulhu, not for horror, but for commentary. Satire, scholarship, and internet performance have all embraced the figure, but in doing so, they reveal something larger. Cthulhu no longer requires belief to function. It has become a conceptual instrument. one that explains, critiques, and endures, even in its dilution. Cthulhu has outgrown its origin. It now exists not only in fiction and media, but in subcultures, academic discourse, satire, and internet ritual. These appropriations do not treat the entity as terrifying in itself, but as a tool, a symbol of absurdity, despair, or intellectual rebellion. The shift is striking. A figure once intended to express the limits of human comprehension has been embraced because of those limits. It is not feared. It is quoted, memed, dissected. This transformation is not mere dilution. It is adaptation. Subcultures do not ignore Lovecraft's themes. They reinterpret them in the language of their own disillusionment. Online, Cthulhu thrives in irony-drenched nihilism. The phrase, "Why vote for the lesser evil? Vote Cthulhu," appeared as early as the 1990s and resurfaces during every U.S. election cycle. At first glance, it's satire, mocking political despair. But beneath the joke is a resonance. Cthulhu represents a cosmic scale of indifference that makes political action feel trivial. The joke works because it names a real feeling. Similarly, social media platforms host thousands of accounts, pages, and groups devoted to Cthulhu for President, Cthulhu Cult Fitness, or Daily Tentacle Blessings. These are not theological movements. They are performances of cosmic absurdity, rituals of emotional insulation in a chaotic world. Academia has responded in kind. Scholars of literature, philosophy, religious studies, and even political theory have treated Lovecraft, and by extension Cthulhu, as a lens through which to view modern anxieties. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, uses Lovecraft to explore the horror of philosophy itself, the moment when thought can no longer reach the real. In such frameworks, Cthulhu is not a monster, but a metaphor for the world without us, a universe that continues, uncaring, even after human meaning collapses. Cthulhu becomes not a being, but a limit concept, a shape that marks where language fails. We must pause here to observe a paradox. Academic analysis has made Cthulhu more precise, but in doing so, it has made it less alien. The very act of interpreting the figure through critical theory tames it. It becomes allegory, not mystery. Yet this is the same pattern found in religious scholarship. The moment a god is systematized, it becomes an object of study rather than devotion. Cthulhu, created in resistance to mythic order, is now enshrined within it. In classrooms and conferences, it stands as a case study in posthumanism, environmental dread, and non-anthropocentric ethics. It survives because it explains things we can't. Cthulhu has also become a mascot for subcultures that flirt with the boundaries of seriousness and satire. In tabletop gaming circles, the figure is invoked both as horror and comedy. In visual arts, it appears in minimalist tattoos, abstract posters, and digital glitch collages. In fashion, it adorns everything from streetwear to occult accessories. These appropriations often celebrate aesthetic over meaning. But again, this fits the original logic. Cthulhu is supposed to resist meaning. In being co-opted for conflicting uses, comedy, scholarship, design, it demonstrates its durability as a symbol of the unsymbolizable. The result is a strange kind of secular reverence. No one worships Cthulhu seriously, yet millions invoke the name, draw the shape, circulate the image. It operates like a modern demon, not in the theological sense, but in the psychological one. It represents everything outside the circle of meaning: futility, entropy, cosmic silence. Its appeal lies not in belief, but in complicity. To joke about Cthulhu is to acknowledge a scale of powerlessness, then laugh anyway. That laughter may be hollow, or honest, or defensive, but it marks a shift from fear to participation. In the final section, we explore the long echo of this shift, not in fiction, not in hoaxes, but in the quiet implications Cthulhu leaves behind. We turn from text to thought, from stories to worldview. What does it mean that the weakest cosmic entity is the one that endures? And what does that endurance say about what we fear now, when no monster is needed to make us feel small? Cthulhu endures because it is the most human-shaped piece of the inhuman. Not in form, its tentacles and wings are deliberately grotesque, but in narrative function. It can be found, described, sketched, even survived. In Lovecraft's mythos, that makes it the most limited. And yet, paradoxically, it is also the most remembered. This contradiction is not an accident. It reveals something fundamental about the way human beings relate to cosmic fear. We do not remember what we cannot name. Cthulhu's weakness is not its power, it is its memorability. And its survival as a symbol suggests that what truly unsettles us is not chaos itself, but the hint of order within it. Consider this. The most terrifying entities in Lovecraft's fiction, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, do not function within narrative structure. They are too vast, too abstract. They cannot speak, appear, or interact without distorting the story into incoherence. Cthulhu, by contrast, fits. Its appearance in the Call of Cthulhu causes disruption, but not collapse. The narrator survives. The story concludes. The documents are organized. The horror is translated into language. This partial survivability allows the mind to engage. The reader walks away shaken, but not shattered. That boundary, just before comprehension fails, is where symbols take root. We must pause here. The psychological impact of Cthulhu is not based on trauma, but on proximity. It comes close enough to awaken dread, but not so close as to silence thought. This structure mirrors real-world experiences of existential anxiety. People are not undone by the vastness of the universe in an astronomical sense. They are undone by the realization that this vastness contains no inherent message. Cthulhu represents that message-shaped absence. It is not malevolent. It is not divine. It is merely there, and that there-ness, that silent, waiting presence, resonates more deeply than outright violence or chaos. Philosophically, Cthulhu represents the inescapable contradiction at the heart of human cognition. We are meaning-making beings in a universe that may not accommodate meaning. The horror is not death, or madness, or even insignificance. It is interpretive failure. Cthulhu haunts the space between comprehension and collapse, where symbols lose stability but not entirely. That zone is psychologically rich. It is where awe and terror blend, where irony and sincerity coexist. And it is in that unstable territory that the myth has taken root, not as fiction, but as metaphor. This is why Cthulhu has become something larger than its original function. It is no longer just a monster. It is a structure of feeling, a way of expressing the weight of living in a world too complex to master and too indifferent to care. It explains ecological collapse, algorithmic control, late capitalist alienation, not directly, but as a mood. When people evoke Cthulhu now, they are not naming a creature. They are naming an experience of seeing something vast, ancient, and unchanging, and knowing that it will not notice them. The final implication may be the most unsettling. Cthulhu is not the strongest because it can be imagined, and yet It is precisely because it can be imagined that it survives. The truly supreme entities, those beyond structure, language, time, do not leave cultural residue. They cannot. Cthulhu's endurance is a kind of proof that we, as a species, return again and again to the edge of our understanding, but rarely step beyond it. We name the darkness, we draw it, we circulate it, we survive it, and in doing so, we choose symbol over silence. Perhaps this is the real function of Cthulhu, not as terror, but as consolation. A reminder that even our most unsettling myths are, in the end, myths we can bear. And the things we cannot bear, we never write about them at all.